Perfect. Yeah, so we're going to be recording this event tonight. Thank you for joining us once again for how the Fluency Development Lesson builds pathways to comprehension. We're going to share this recording out afterwards, and we're also going to share it in the North Carolina TRL North Carolina member hub. My name is Sean Lindsay. I am your events coordinator for the North Carolina chapter of the Reading League. And please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. We're so excited to have you with us. I'm going to read this off of the screen because it is so important. I don't want to mess this up. Our mission is to advance the awareness, the understanding, and the use of evidence-aligned reading instruction across North Carolina. We want to do that by creating a community of statewide collaborators invested in ensuring that all children receive equitable literacy instruction. And so we are so excited to have some of our partners here from Benchmark Education because as they are sponsoring this event, they're also equally invested in making sure that we bring equitable literacy instruction, clearly not just in North Carolina, but nationwide. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Jamie Higgins, who will be introducing Benchmark Education and furthermore introducing Dr. Lynne Kulich, our speaker for the evening.
Yes, thank you, Sean. And good evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Higgins. I am the sales consultant for Benchmark Education located in Raleigh. And I'm joined by my colleague Rebecca Lewis, who's based in Charlotte. And just wanted to say thank you to the Reading League North Carolina and Dr. Coolidge for providing this event. And thank you to all of you who are taking time out of your evening after a long day to join us tonight. Um, Benchmark Education is really proud to sponsor this evening's session. And for those of you who are just learning about Benchmark, it's a family-owned company that has been focused solely on providing high-quality, research-based literacy resources for over 25 years. And Benchmark Advance is our award-winning comprehensive core program that connects to an ecosystem of supplemental and intervention solutions. I also think it's important to note that Benchmark provides a range of professional development books by experts in the field with the PD Essentials collection, and we'll learn more specifically about the Fluency Development Lesson this evening, and we'll share a promo code for anyone interested in purchasing after tonight's session. So, without any other delay, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Lynne Kulich, who will be leading us tonight. Dr. Kulich is the head of growth for literacy at MGT, and she has over 30 years of experience in education working directly with students, families, educators, and researchers. Her studies include early literacy and multilingual learners. She's a former professor, curriculum and instruction director, literacy coach, and classroom teacher. She earned a doctoral degree in curriculum and instruction and a master's degree in elementary education from the University of Akron, as well as a bachelor's degree in foreign language education from The Ohio State University. She's the author, researcher, consultant, and presenter at international and national conferences, and the lead author of the Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap, which is a bestseller. And most recently, her work includes curriculum development for the Georgia Department of Education FLES program and supporting new principals with the Ohio Principal Mentoring Program. She's a national program reviewer for the International Literacy Association, a member of the Reading League Ohio, Ohio Council of Teachers of English Language Arts, and the Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development. That is quite the resume, Dr. Coolidge, and we are just so pleased to have you leading us this evening. And Lynn, you may still be muted.
There we go. Okay. Like I haven't done this before, right? Jamie, Sean, thank you so much. It's such an honor. Nothing I'd really rather do than spend an evening with educators. So this is great. I am from Ohio and proud member of the Ohio chapter of the Reading League. And so I'm just so grateful that you're all here this evening. And my goal is that the time is well spent for you, that when you leave, you've got some new knowledge and are ready to apply that with the students you're working with. And while your school year is coming to an end, it might be something to noodle on as you prepare for next fall. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. And here's just a brief agenda. I'm going to start by talking about some hot topics right now that educators across the country are talking about. We're going to dive into the active view of reading and fluency's role, and then really talk about what does explicit fluency instruction look like. So, I'm very blessed to travel throughout the country and talk to educators. And honestly, it doesn't matter what state, whether I'm in New York or I'm out in Seattle or even in the Charlotte area. All of us tend to be talking about the same things in terms of science of reading. So, if you wouldn't mind, take just a second and go ahead and type in chat. What are some things that come to mind that maybe you and your colleagues are talking about in terms of science of reading or literacy? So go ahead, I'll give you a second to put some of those in chat. And FYI, I don't see the chat on my side. So any of my team members here, if you want to shout out anything, feel free. I don't mind that at all. All right, I'm going to go
So,
ahead. Oh, yeah,
Lynn, one thing
yeah,
one
fun.
thing I'm seeing in the chat so far is language comprehension, syntax, and its role in reading comprehension.
Love
I'm
it.
also hearing a lot about how do you make the science of reading stick? How do you make it sticky?
Vicky. Yeah, love it.
And language comprehension just came up again, as well as word recognition.
Yep, that's a big hot topic. Yeah, thank you. So, just for fun, I'm going to rattle off some of the things that I hear quite a bit from educators. And ironically, I could add slide after slide, right? And I don't even think I put language comprehension in here, but I certainly talk a lot about it. I write a lot of blogs about it, so it's extremely important. But here are some things I hear from educators: equity, MTSS, phonics, joy, stamina, and joy in terms of reading, right? And stamina in terms of reading, dyslexia, three queuing, multilingual learners, content knowledge, universal screening, foundational skills, phonics, structured literacy, leveled reader, simple view, morphology, grade level text, graduation, Scarborough's rope, chronic absenteeism, third grade retention, and professional development. So, here's what I think we need to be talking a lot about, and this is going to be no surprise, right? The topic tonight is fluency, and not just fluency assessments, but fluency instruction. So, I'd like to do a brief activity. If I can get a volunteer who is willing to come off mute. And I'd love for the volunteer to read what you see on the screen. And it's a short text. I promise you that. That's the only thing I'll promise you. And that it also is in English. So if I could get a volunteer, that would be great.
I'll do it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Okay. All right, let me just click through this and let's find out if Susan is a fluent reader.
Awful Henry's it basket rotten pinched. As he they grabbed Washington would Henry knows. From why asked these smelled. A pawpaw his to surprise smell like. It the smell and George they.
Susan, that was excellent. So if you could hear everyone, we're clapping at the moment. That was really great. Now, I want everyone to imagine, and Susan, by the way, you can stay unmuted because you're not quite done.
Okay.
But, I want everyone to imagine if Susan were, say, a third grader, and I had her seated next to me and I asked her to read this out loud. And, maybe I had a classroom of, I don't know, 25 students. Would I be concerned about her? I would say no, because although I did not calculate her reading rate, she read really automatically. I also watched the text closely and I didn't see any miscues at all. I would also argue that she certainly wasn't monotone. I mean, there was definitely some good prosody in there. So, quite honestly, I wouldn't be worried about Susan at all. Now, Susan, let's find out what you learned. What did Henry grab?
A basket.
Why was Henry surprised?
Oh,
And what would George
it,
Washington think?
yeah, I had a hard time reading it because I realized it wasn't making sense, but I'm a proficient reader and I was like,
Yes,
oh
absolutely.
goodness.
So,
So,
yeah, but oftentimes what happens is we calculate students' reading rate. We may or may not do a retelling, and we assume that because they've decoded automatically, accurately, and maybe even with a little bit of prosody, that they're a great proficient reader. And what research is showing us is that's not often the case. Oh gosh, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, in the early 2000s, I remember reading an article about a second grade teacher, Dr. Mary Applegate, and she wrote an article exactly about this, how she had really dismissed a particular second grade student because every time she assessed the student's oral reading fluency, they did fine. Their rate was perfect. Lo and
right.
behold, the student suffered greatly because she only assumed that fluency was just about rate. So, what we know to be true is that fluency is so much more than rate, or the word that I like to use, or should I say, don't like to use, is speed. It's so much more than that. And unfortunately, oftentimes we miscommunicate to students, intentionally or unintentionally, that reading fluency is about speed, and it's not. In fact, what we know to be true is that the pace with which students read is important, but actually processing the meaning, comprehending in real time, and phrasing the text with appropriate prosody are more important indicators of fluency. So, how do we make sure that students become fluent? Well, this is where explicit instruction comes into play. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the verbal efficiency theory, but this theory was first noted in 1979 by Perfetti and Lesgol. And what they did is they noted that fluency was really more than just rate or automaticity, and that if students were going to comprehend what they read, that they needed to be sure to not just read automatically, but comprehend in real time, decode accurately, and with prosody. And so, what I've done when I talk to educators throughout the country is I've created this simple, silly graphic of a cap because I think verbal efficiency theory really means that students have to comprehend in real time, they have to decode accurately and automatically, and they have to read with prosody. So, this is how I talk about fluency. It's CAP. So, what I want to do is kind of press pause for a moment on the whole definition of fluency. And I want to kind of take a walk down memory lane. How in the world did we get here? In other words, what's causing all this noise? Why are we talking about, closing the opportunity gap? Or why are we still concerned about those students who, were in starting kindergarten when we were on the cusp of COVID, right? Why are we concerned about their graduation rate? All of those things. So I want to look at four pieces of data: NAEP, National Council for Teacher Quality Study, the New Teacher Project study, and just a slide about the COVID pandemic. So if you're not familiar with NAEP data, which I can't imagine that you're not because it's pretty infamous. The difference to note is that NAEP data highlights proficiency scores according to the NAEP rubric. This is not proficiency scores to individual states. But I like to compare NAEP data from 2019, just on the cusp of COVID, to 2024. And what we know to be true, according to the data, is that for fourth grade students, 39 states or jurisdictions saw decreases in fourth grade reading scores during that time period. North Carolina saw decreases, and my home state of Ohio. 12 states saw no significant change, and Louisiana was the only state that showed improvement. Here's what's interesting. Oftentimes we don't talk about eighth grade, and eighth grade scores were actually a little worse. 38 states or jurisdictions saw decreases. Here again, North Carolina and Ohio. 14 states saw not a single change, and not a single state showed any improvement. In addition, I guess I want to ask this question, how well are we growing students? Well, according to the National Center for Education Statistics 2025, 31% of fourth graders nationwide can read at or above NAEP proficient levels. 80% of students eligible for free or reduced lunch are not at or above the proficient level. And this is an important percentage, 75%. Nationwide, unfortunately, 10 to 15% of students won't graduate, and over 75% of those students will report difficulties learning to read. So, right, we're educators, we can connect those dots. If we can tackle that, this reading proficiency score, we can simultaneously address the dropout rate. So, how well have states responded? Well, I believe in North Carolina, like Ohio, we have something called the third grade reading guarantee. And in essence, we've got some consequences, right? And I really want to focus tonight on how do we prevent students from dropping out? How do we prevent students from not garnering a proficiency score? Our states have decided that if students don't get a proficiency score in third grade, they could be retained. So why are we talking so much about proficiency scores, right? Well, because fluency is significantly associated or impacts comprehension. In fact, we have research that suggests 20 to 70% of any change or difference in comprehension scores can be explained by fluency in grades 1 through 9. So, fluency is a pretty big deal. So here's a synthesis of research from Stevens, Walker, and Vaughn. And what they did, and this came out in 2017, and it's a synthesis of research from 2001 to 2014. And they looked at the effects of reading fluency interventions on elementary students with learning disabilities. And what they found is that those interventions not only improved fluency, but the ultimate goal of comprehension. However, I typically ask this question, fluency who? In 1983, and I quoted his research in my dissertation, Richard Allington said, fluency is the neglected reading goal. If a lack of fluency in oral reading is often noted as a characteristic of poor readers, but we rarely address it. And I always am asking educators as I travel, why do we assess what we don't teach? How many of you are assessing for oral reading fluency maybe 3 times a year with a benchmark screener, right? And that's great. I'm not suggesting it's not, but we certainly are assessing fluency enough, but are we actually teaching it? And if we think about it, if we're not teaching it, that's a little bit crazy. We're teaching students to orthographically map letters and sounds, and then we're assessing it. So shouldn't we be doing the same with fluency? So this is familiar, I'm sure, to all of us by now, Scarborough's reading rope, and we know the 2 major constructs or strands, the language comprehension strands and the word recognition strands. But what is often not suggested or mentioned is right here in that yellow box. Something's happening that brings those strands together, and that is fluency. And what we know to be true is that it doesn't just happen automatically. 75 to 90% of our 3rd and 4th grade students who don't get, say, a proficient or a decent score on a high stakes reading test, be it your state proficiency exam, etc., they have gaps in accurate word recognition, automatic word recognition, and or prosodic reading. And right there is fluency. Just because we teach students to orthographically map letters and sounds, it doesn't just mean that automatically students are going to become fluent. We have to provide explicit instruction. So, to get to sort of the meat of our discussion this evening, I want to talk about the active view of reading. And little by little, as I'm traveling throughout and talking to educators, more educators are aware of this active view of reading by Duke and Cartwright. It came out in 2021. And what you are looking at is this graphic where they've really recognized the simple view of reading as kind of, quote, being simple. They recognize its validity, but what they've suggested is there's a little more to actually reading than just that. And they've noted things like self-regulation in the green. And then what I want to draw your attention to here are the bridging processes in purple. These are the processes, such as reading fluency, that have been found in a study by Duke Cartwright and Matthew Burns from Florida. They found that in a study, when teachers intervened within the bridging processes, it had the greatest effect size, and you can see those effect sizes there, 0.70. It had the greatest effect size on improving or impacting reading comprehension when they intervened with those bridging processes. So think about that. All right, let's look at the National Council for Teacher Quality study. If you've not looked at this before, I highly encourage you to do that. You can toggle by state. And in a nutshell here, what you're looking at is in 2023, they did another study where they analyzed all of the higher ed institutions throughout the country. And they looked at their pre-service or even graduate level teaching courses on how to teach reading. And they rated them with an A or a B based on how well they were preparing pre-service or current teachers to actually teach the 5 foundational skills that you see there at the bottom: phonemic awareness, vocabulary, etc. And you can see in blue the national averages, and look at fluency. And hats off to North Carolina, because this is not the case at all in my home state. In fact, in my home state of Ohio, I think it's like 53% of the institutions received an A or a B. So think about that for a moment. If we know how significantly fluency impacts comprehension, why are we not better preparing teachers to teach it when it has such a great impact on comprehension? All right, let's look at the new teacher project study. And this came out a while ago now in 2018, but still very pertinent to talk about. This study came out, and the title of the research study was called The Opportunity Myth. And researchers looked at students in a typical classroom, and what they noted is that the students were meeting class expectations about 71% of the time. So not bad. But then they flipped that coin, so to speak, and they said, wait a minute. Let's do a crosswalk and let's look at how well students are actually meeting grade level standards, right? Instead of just class expectations. And what they found is those same students were only meeting grade level state standards 17% of the time. And they called this study the opportunity myth because what they found is that, oftentimes we tell students, hey, if you work hard, you get A's and B's, like you're going to be set. If you want to go to college or the workforce or military, you're golden, right? And that's not really the case. And so we've got to stop lowering the bar and raising the rigor. So if we're going to talk about opportunity, we have to talk about equity. And equity doesn't mean lowering expectations. And I think sometimes we do it unintentionally. We mean no harm by it. But if we think about it, building equity in our classrooms is about providing access to students using high quality materials. We have to have high expectations. And this is where rock star instruction has to come into play, right? Goals and expectations really should be the same for all students. And I know that's hard sometimes, but really they have to be. What changes are the supports that we provide every student. This is an article I've talked about for quite some time. This is a picture here, if you don't know, of Dr. Tim Shanahan from the University of Illinois in Chicago. And this article came out in 2014. Back then, he was talking about why it's so important for us to teach students with grade level text, not text at their instructional level, below their grade level. And ironically, sitting on the side of my desk here is his newest book, Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. And I don't know if you follow me on LinkedIn, but the last couple of weeks I've been posting a few times a week synopses of each of the chapters and what kind of stands out to me from his new book. But here's an important quote from Tim. He says, "The point shouldn't be to place students in books easy enough to ensure good reading, but to provide enough support, enough scaffolding to allow them to read harder books successfully. I want you to put a pin in that because we're going to resurface this quote here. So if we're talking about equity, we have to talk about complex text and why they're so important. So imagine if you all are third graders, but your instructional reading level is at the first or second grade level. So you spend the majority of time with your teacher reading books at your instructional level, at the second or first grade level. And so how in the world will you learn new vocabulary at the quote third grade level or beyond? You won't. How are you going to have the opportunity to decode complex syntax if you're reading text at the first grade level? You won't. And how in the world are you going to build new content knowledge if you're reading about content knowledge that's part of the first or second grade curriculum? You won't. So I took a look here at your North Carolina DPI, your standards and what it said about fluency. And it talked about how the teacher has to foster students' oral reading fluency with a variety of increasingly complex text. In fact, you see it highlighted there throughout. I also absolutely love that in North Carolina at the bottom, you see a quote from my colleague and friend, Tim Rosinski, about the importance of fluency in terms of developing good readers. So you might be wondering, like many do throughout the country, what if grade level isn't the student's level? So what if your students are reading at a 400 Lexile and your grade level text is 600 Lexile? Shouldn't you just give them an easier text to read? Well, I think we should change the question. What if grade level isn't the student's level yet? We've got to get that student up to that 600 Lexile level. How do we do that? Well, fluency is your scaffold. And so we're going to talk about some evidence-based practices. But just a little bit more data, because I'm often asked, really, are you sure? Can striving readers really access grade level text? Absolutely. And in fact, what the researchers there in that second bullet point noted is that practicing reading aloud mattered, level of text did not. So why not expose students to grade level vocabulary, syntax, and content knowledge? Finally, let's just show a slide here about the COVID pandemic. And certainly what we know is that the pandemic has hurt or disenfranchised the most disenfranchised, right? The most vulnerable students. And so if you think about where those students were when we first, experienced COVID and went virtual, they're in middle school now. So how are they doing, right? Because oftentimes our focus is on elementary students, but I also want to be very cognizant that we've got to pay attention to our adolescent readers. So all of that to say, how in the world do we stop these rumors? Wouldn't it be lovely if we no longer had to talk about the opportunity gap or closing the achievement gap or the graduation rate? How do we do that? Well, first and foremost, one of the things I'm known for saying is assessments don't close reading gaps. It's true. Now, that's not to say we don't need them, right? We can't do any instruction in the absence of assessment data. However, assessments alone won't do anything. So I think we need a mindset shift. I think we need to just not only ask, how are you assessing oral reading fluency, or how are your students' oral reading fluency scores, but how are you teaching fluency? Wouldn't that be great if we started asking our colleagues that, and then also asking, how are students practicing fluency? This is going to make a huge difference. All right. So what I would love to talk about now, and you're probably anxious as well, is what does explicit fluency instruction look like? So I want to start off with a couple slides before I dive into a lot of evidence-based practices. These probably look familiar to you, right? Most elementary teachers are very familiar with these images like the Dolch sight words or the Fry words, right? I remember teaching first, second, third grade, and this is when we used to send these lists home with families. We'd talk about them at conferences. We'd ask families to practice, kind of drilling these words with their students. I had to call students up one by one. I can close my eyes and still see it. They'd come up to my desk and I'd give them a list and I'd ask them to read them out loud. Well, what we've come to understand about sight words is something that Tim Rosinski says all the time, and I'm always quoting him on this. Every word wants to become a sight word. It's not just these list of quote sight words. Every word needs to become a sight word. And when we teach students to orthographically map, that's how those words become stamped kind of into their memory, right? Into their lexicon. And I want to take it a step further because you might be familiar with Dr. Mark Seidenberg from the University of Wisconsin, and I love his work. And he mentions that something very true that we learn words by the company they keep. And so the title of this slide here, the heading is Three's Company. Think about those sight words in column A, there, to, with, they. It would be so much better. Think kindergarten, right? Because when we're talking about building fluency, we're not just talking about, second grade beyond or third grade beyond. Even in kindergarten, right? We can work on fluency with decodable text and beginning of first grade with those sight words, but it's so much more advantageous to embed those sight words in short phrases or sentences, right? Look at column B. Instead of asking students to just kind of, quickly decode the word there, put it in a short sentence. There it is. Now it carries some meaning. Better yet, put it in a short sentence with phrase boundaries and teach and encourage them to read that word within a sentence with appropriate prosody, right? Put in punctuation marks. Instead of just having them decode the word to, put it in a short sentence. Time to eat, right? She wants to swim in the pool. Now we've surrounded and embedded that word with meaning. And it's just so much, we don't have a lot of time during the day, right? So let's not waste it. And the point of learning words is to comprehend. So I want to pause, and I would love it if you would put in the chat, and I'm going to call on Sean again if he's there and he doesn't mind. If you would put in the chat, what are some things that either if you're a classroom teacher that you are doing in your classrooms that sort of scream fluency instruction, or maybe you're a building principal, a district administrator, if you were doing a walkthrough and you were looking for fluency activities, what would you expect to see or hear? So I'll give you a second to do that. Take a drink here of my water.
Yes, please hydrate, Lynn. You're doing an awesome job. Let's see. I see a few already in the chat. Some choral reading, some echo reading, partner reading, swooping. That was going to be mine, Nicole. Swooping, partner reading, paragraph shrinking. Um, let's see. More partner reading, repeated reads as a highly important section. Oh, sorry. Repeated reads of a highly important section of a larger text. Um, reading aloud with follow-up questions and discussion or reasoning. You're nodding your head. It sounds like those things
Yep.
are maybe some things you're going to talk about.
Absolutely. And, I have to say, like, wink, nod, I'm not surprised, right? Especially, and I don't know where these educators are from, but just with that mindset that in North Carolina, they seem to be doing a really good job preparing teachers to teach fluency. So those were all great comments, and I'm going to dive into some of those. And I also want to call out, I love the viewer who typed in about shrinking repeated reading. So if it's a longer text, just pulling out maybe a single paragraph, that's important. And I'm going to mention that again later too. So let's talk about teaching reading fluency. Now, what you see up on the screen, that first bullet point, it says, it requires time. And I have there 15, 20 minutes, but I don't want to scare you with that. It could be 10 minutes. Towards the end of my presentation, I'm going to tell you how you can do it in 2 minutes. But the point being that if we're going to teach students to orthographically map letters and sounds, you're going to spend significant amounts of time teaching them to do that. So you need to think about fluency in the same way. So, what are some of those evidence-based instructional practices? And as Sean said, I did a lot of nodding. You all were calling out some great evidence-based practices. Modeling fluent reading. How do you do that? That is not via round robin reading, right? We are no longer doing round robin reading. That is not an evidence-based practice. And side note, if there are any of you that are on here that maybe you're a secondary teacher and just throwing it out there, maybe you're a social studies teacher or a science teacher, right? Connect with your ELA colleagues because they are likely able to share some evidence-based practices with you if you're not familiar. And so it's important to note that round robin reading is not a way to practice fluency. And oftentimes I feel like it happens in some of the other content areas. And it in part because they just don't realize it's not an evidence-based practice. So second bullet point, choral and echo reading. Absolutely. I heard it from you out there. Phrase reading, partner reading, repeated reading, reader's theater, and what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is the Fluency Development Lesson. So let me give you a little history of the Fluency Development Lesson and how I encountered it. So the National Reading Panel in 2000, you may have heard of it, came out with a report. It's hard to believe that was like 25, 26 years ago now. And in the report, I noted this quote, and I wanted to share it here. Fluent readers can read text with speed. Again, I would prefer automaticity there. Accuracy and proper expression. Fluency depends upon well-developed word recognition skills, but such skills do not inevitably lead to fluency. Fluency is a critical component of skilled reading. Nevertheless, it is often neglected in classroom instruction. Yes, Richard Allington told us that in 1983, so clearly not much had changed by then. Here's something else the National Reading Panel included in their report. They included a study by Rosinski, Paddock, Lynne, and Sturtevant. And this study was about, voila, the Fluency Development Lesson. And that is when I discovered it. And at the time, in 2001, I was transitioning from teaching French in an elementary school in Georgia and moved back to Ohio. And I was going to teach first grade for the first time, all subjects in English. And I had uncovered the Fluency Development Lesson, and I tweaked it ever so slightly with Tim's approval. And what I decided, I used it in first, second, and third grade. And there was nothing I did that grew my readers more than the Fluency Development Lesson. I used it in Tier 1 core instruction faithfully every day. Just as I took attendance every day and who was buying versus packing back in the day, I did the Fluency Development Lesson. It was also one of the most joyful times. That 15, 20 minutes every day brought so much joy to me and my students. So much so that I decided I wanted to pursue my doctorate, and I knew that I was going to do research with the Fluency Development Lesson. And so you see here on the screen a snapshot of just a few different studies in which the Fluency Development Lesson was implemented. And the top one is actually my doctoral research. I did a case study, and what's important to note is this case study was on 3 middle school students. So not just elementary, but middle school. So Let me give you an overview of how I expanded the fluency development lesson and maybe a little more context here. When Tim and his colleagues created it, it was really sort of a one-off, if you will. It was one text on one day, and they embedded some evidence-based practices. What I discovered is in order to embed this notion of repeated reading, let's repeat and reread that same text for 5 days straight. So in essence, I created a 5-day lesson plan for the fluency development lesson. And here's an overview for you. What's wonderful about this lesson is that it just doesn't focus on reading per se, but all of literacy, listening, speaking, reading, and emphasis on writing, and with a grade level text. Every year I had students who were receiving Title I services. Every year I had multilingual learners in my classroom. I'd use this in core instruction every day, and I saw incredible growth. Every student was reading either at and many above grade level based on our benchmark screening by the end of the year. It embeds echo, choral, phrase, repeated, and partner reading, all of those things that we know are evidence-based practices. You can include readers' theater. I used to embed poetry parties. And it doesn't just focus on fluency. It focuses on all of the foundational skills, as you'll see. And it can be used in grades K-12, especially with EBs or MLLs. What I want to note for you is that I used poetry, but you absolutely do not have to. You can use any text, and I'll show you examples of that. Something that I did in my doctoral work, because I was working specifically with emergent bilinguals, I did a crosswalk of the FDL, the Fluency Development Lesson, with the SIOP model, structured, sheltered instruction observation protocol model. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a model for teaching multilingual learners. And so I crosswalked all of the activities that I did with the FDL and showed how it aligned to the suggested supports that multilingual learners need. So we know those multilingual learners, they are superheroes. And I like to think of this as the superhero crosswalk. Just to share an anecdote, when I was doing my doctoral research, I was working with refugee children from Myanmar. And, they weren't just learning the language, they were obviously learning our culture and personal hygiene. Many of these students, they bathed in rivers. They didn't know what toothpaste or a toothbrush was, let alone, in the example here, toilet paper. And so I chose a lot of Shel Silverstein poems because they kind of lended themselves nicely to talking about personal hygiene. And this was a poem I chose, and I'll never forget one of the middle school students, his name was Echo. I had them wrap me with toilet paper, and I'm acting out what a mummy is because I thought, how am I going to get them to understand the word mummy? And there was a community center, and on Saturdays the kids would go to the community center, and that's where there was a TV, and so they watched cartoons. And one of the boys, I think he was a 7th grader, he yelled Scooby-Doo, and I thought, oh, sigh of relief. They have figured out now what mummy is. So and this image just shows you an example of the writing activities that we did, because we know that reading and writing are synergistic. All right, so let's try, or some activities, so to speak. I'm going to show you some of the activities that are in the book by Benchmark, the Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap. Dr. Tim Rosinski and David L. Harrison, former poet laureate for the state of Missouri, are my co-authors. And really, we created this based on a response from educators. I heard so many times, hey, Lynn, we love the fluency development lesson. Do you have text already at grade level with the activities built out? So I went to Tim. I said, hey, do you think we can do this? He said, absolutely. We connected with David, and we chose poetry because that's what we love. And this book is for grades 1 through 5. There are 28 units in the book. Remember, a unit is 5 days worth of lessons. A wink and a nod, we actually created 50 units. So there are 22 that have yet to be published. And so I know Benchmark will be making a decision as to whether they publish the other 22. But I'm going to just give you a sneak peek of what some of those look like. So this is one of the poems. It's called Not Yet. And again, if I didn't mention it, this book is for grades 1 through 5. And so here's the poem. And what you're going to see is I'm going to walk you through what it looks like for the first day. And I want you to pay attention to all of the scaffolding that's embedded into the beginning of the week. And as the week goes on, little by little, you remove those scaffolds because the students don't need them anymore. So on Monday, you present the new poem or text. You read it several times, right? You're modeling fluent reading. The purpose of reading is comprehension. So you're going to discuss the poet's purpose, their style. You're going to want to pre-teach vocabulary. And here's an important point, number 4. This is not willy-nilly, right? I know you have to use high quality curriculum. Take what you have. I mean, I'd love for you to use the poems and the lessons in this book, but the nice thing in this book is we create a framework for you to create your own lesson. So pull a text from your scope and sequence, right? Look at what you're studying that week. Are you working on onomatopoeias or alliteration or rhymes or riddles? What is it that you're doing in your core curriculum that you can support with the fluency development lesson? You wrap up that 15-minute lesson with the students doing a choral echo of you. Here's an example of pre-teaching some vocabulary, right? Especially if you have multilingual learners. Marmoset, you might need to pre-teach that. Clarinet, not all your students will know what a clarinet is. Tuesday, second day with the same text, you reread it. I actually am a proponent of teaching students what fluency is, right? What the heck is it? Well, it's about automaticity, accuracy, and prosody. And my first graders could explain that. I think it's important because we want them to be fluent readers. We need to tell them what components they need to demonstrate. Now your students are going to chorally read the poem. And notice how the scaffolds disappear. You're going to group them and have them read different stanzas. You can have a lot of fun with this. And then back to your core curriculum. Are you working on short vowels or consonant clusters, digraphs, synonyms, etc.? You're going to do some word work. Pull those things out of that text. Here you can see I took the text and I just highlighted the 3 different stanzas, and you can strategically decide who reads the largest stanza there. Maybe it's your students that need the most support and you read with them. Or, it's Tuesday, second day, maybe you want your stronger readers to model and have the larger stanza to read. Here's a writing activity. Maybe you're working on riddles. So here's an activity aligned to that poem where you can do a language experience approach and create a riddle together as a class. Or maybe you group your students and have them collaborate together. Wednesday, day 3, same text, but I promise you the students will not get bored because you're giving them a different purpose for reading and you're giving them different activities to do. So day 3, teacher and students chorally read the poem. Every day you want to start off with that choral read. Now the students partner read, and you know this, you have to teach students how to partner read, right? It's important that they understand what it looks like, what it sounds like, and how partners should give feedback. Then you rejoin together as a whole group and you ask for volunteers to read the poem. You may not get your striving readers on this day, but by the end of the week you will. Then, if you're familiar with Tim Rosinski, he's infamous for his word ladders. And so in our book, for every unit on Wednesday, you will find your very own word ladder aligned to that poem. Something students can do whole class, in small group, with a partner, or even individually. Thursday, students quarterly read and self-evaluate. Volunteers read for the class. Something else I should mention, and I didn't here, but we spell this out in the book, is on Mondays, you might want to record your students when they do like a choral read or maybe Tuesday. and record them each day, because at the end of the week, you're going to play back those recordings so that they can actually hear their growth. And what's really nice is that when you ask for volunteers to read, be strategic. Maybe it's a striving reader with a really strong reader. Today, you're going to get some of those students who are striving. You're going to get your multilingual learners, right? On Thursday, students take that text home, that poem home. And I know what some of you are thinking. There's no way, we no longer assign homework, etc. Work around it. Don't let that be a barrier. When I used the fluency development lesson, I sent it home. They had poetry folders. It was their homework that night. If students didn't have someone to read to, we know that happens, that's reality. They can read to a rock, a pet, a stuffed animal. They can grab a pretend microphone and read like they're a reporter looking at themselves in the mirror, right? And then there was a writing activity on the back. And just a quick anecdote to share. The other colleagues, teachers in the district where I worked, started hearing about the fluency development lesson that I was doing. And so they asked me to share, and I did. And fast forward, my own two of my three, my two youngest, had teachers that implemented the fluency development lesson. And they would come home with a poem to read with a writing activity. And this was the sweetest part. My husband traveled a lot, and I was working on my doctorate at night. And so on Thursdays, my parents were watching my kids. And so my parents would sign the sheet that they listened to my boys read. And sometimes they would even, there were writing activities where we ask, someone else at home to respond with a sentence, etc. And so I still have all of those with my parents' signatures on them. So here's an example of a writing activity that you'll see in the book. And I don't know if you can tell here, but there's actually 3 prompts, all similar, but it gives you an opportunity to differentiate. Maybe you want to pick one prompt for a certain group of students. One prompt might be too challenging, but another one just right. So we give you some options. Friday, my favorite day, it is the 5th day with the same text. All of your students are able to read that text, and so now you have a lot of fun. You pretend to be actors on a stage, and you tell your students, how do you want to read this poem today? Do you want to be angry? Do you want to be scared? Do you want to be sleepy? Etc. Then you ask them to perform for different people. And this is not something you need to plan in advance. You don't have time for that. Literally, I would open up my classroom door and I would usher in our custodian, Mr. Mark, and I'd say, hey, Mr. Mark, you have to come in and listen to my students read. And the students are just beaming. And the custodian loves to be included in that, right? You might even, I've invited the principal in. Back in the day, before whiteboards, I used to have a hanging chart and I'd wheel it across the room to another classroom, and we'd take less than 60 seconds to read that text to that class. And then we did something called mystery readers. So I would send students out into the hall, maybe 2 of them, and I would ask for students who might like to read the poem, and I would record them. We'd invite the students in the hallway back in, play back the recording, and they had to guess who the readers were. And this is no exaggeration. By January, my students who volunteered to be the mystery readers would disguise their voice to sort of throw off those students who had to guess who the mystery reader was. I mean, that's the joy of reading right there. And all of my students could do it. Didn't matter if they were going to Title I or they were multilingual learner students. So as we wrap up here, start to wrap up my portion, I wanted to share with you some really incredible data. This is such a great story. So I'll bring this data up on the screen and give you a little context. A year ago, a literacy specialist in Howard County Schools reached out to Tim and me via LinkedIn, and she said, hey, I just want to let you know I bought your book and I'm a literacy specialist, and my job is to work 20 minutes a day with first through fifth grade students in a kind of a tier two intervention setting. And I just decided, with permission, that the only thing I'm going to do is the fluency development lesson because that's all I've got with them. I've got 20 minutes. So she did, and she started sending us data. So we've scrubbed it here, but what you can see, she had to benchmark with Dibbles and the Maze assessment. And what she noted is that what you're seeing are 5 students in her fifth grade tier two group. They made an average gain of 45 words correct per minute in just 5 weeks, right? And that's reading a new text. And what you can notice is that by the middle of the year, right, you can see their Dibble scores, and the student B actually made good progress, but the student stutters and has a lot of anxiety. And she noted anecdotally that this was a really bad day for this student and noticed their score in the red at 374. So again, that's where triangulating data is important and understanding, hey, what were those affective things that might have been happening that day? On another note, she also sent me recordings because she started working with the elementary music teacher. And the music teacher was writing sheet music to the poems, and the students were going to music class and they were singing the poems. So it was just really phenomenal what she was doing. So we were able to present at the not the Massachusetts, the Maryland Reading Conference last spring, SAMLA. I got to do a keynote, and also we did a breakout session together, sharing this work. So some of you might be thinking, that as the literacy teacher, or, if you're a middle school teacher and maybe you're teaching math or science or social studies, right? You can do the fluency development lesson in other content areas. My oldest son is an 8th grade math teacher, and I have said to him, take a story problem. You've got 2 minutes left, and, shenanigans are going on, whatever, they're packing up. Do a choral reading of this, or repeated reading, or have them read it in a funny voice for fun. But it could take 2 minutes max, right? And I said your ELA teachers will appreciate you. You can use a science text, right? So it doesn't have to just be poetry or that story from your core curriculum. Here's a biology text. You could use this in high school. And let's not forget gym class, because this is an actual text about the history of volleyball. And wouldn't it be awesome if, as part of the instruction around how to play volleyball, was also reading an article about the history and how volleyball became a sport? So with that, I want to leave you with a few open sourced resources that you can access. The first one is to my dear friend and colleague, Tim Rosinski's site. He's got plenty of resources there for you. The second one is evidence-based reading interventions from the University of Florida. And the last one there is from the National Center on Improving Literacy. So certainly don't want you to think that you have to purchase anything, right? Here are really 3 great resources that will help shed light on some evidence-based practices so that you can be certain to explicitly teach fluency.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kulich, for the opportunity to learn from you this evening. So many practical strategies and actionable fluency strategies for the classroom. This has been amazing.
Oh.
I'm Rebecca Lewis, and with Jamie Higgins and Shannon Barnett, we represent Benchmark Education Company in North Carolina. Benchmark has been delighted to partner with the Reading League to bring Dr. Kulich to our community and beyond this evening. We appreciate your participation and enthusiasm so much. The Fluency Development Lesson can be ordered through Benchmark with an excellent study guide to support your district or school-based professional learning. And Jamie has dropped the promo code in the chat, which allows for you to have 10% off of the Fluency Development Lesson or the combined study guide. And aligned with Dr. Kulich's content this evening are 2 of Benchmark's newest resources. Dynamax decodables do more with decodable text by integrating knowledge building, comprehension, and fluency into
Yes,
highly engaging.
with decodable text, right?
Yeah,
It can be done.
it can be done. And then our new Decodable Readers Theater for grades K-5 really strengthen foundational skills and build fluency as well. And finally, to stay up to date on Dr. Kulich's work and or if you'd like info on any of the resources we've mentioned this evening, please scan this QR code. It will take you to a feedback form and an opt-in for the resources to be sent to you. So Dr. Kulich and the Reading League team, we just thank you for your work and for your contribution to our learning and ultimately to our students' success this evening. Sean, over to you for some wrap up.
And everybody, thank you once again, Dr. Coolidge. If we can just give her some smiley faces in the chat, some thank yous in the chat. And before you go, we have one more thing to share with you. So don't change that dial, if you will. But thank you once again to Benchmark for helping to bring all of this information to everybody who was able to join us today. And Dr. Coolidge, it was incredible to get the opportunity to learn from you tonight. This was our penultimate, our second to last event of this school year. We've had a year full of events. Our year is actually culminating with this event that's on the screen right now, our second annual summer virtual symposium. The title is Roots to Results, Growing Literacy in the Carolinas Through the Science of Reading Implementation. This event is going to have two incredible keynote speakers. It's going to have 12 different breakout sessions, all for the low, low price of $10 for our TRL NC and TRL South Carolina members. If you are coming from outside of North Carolina, you are still welcome to join. You can join at the cost of $40. I'll drop the link to register in the chat, but this is an all-day event. It's the event of the summer. You're not going to want to miss it. And all of those sessions are going to be recorded just like this session was tonight. So you can rewatch it, watch it with your peers, watch it with your dog. And once again,
Or your pet rock, right?
or your pet rock, or the custodian in your school, or you can like there's so many things that you could do with it. So so excited that you all are able to join us. And once again, we would love for you to stay connected with us. You can stay connected with us, join TRLNC by clicking or scanning that QR code. Or if you had more questions, because Dr. Coolidge, the chat was on fire. People had questions for you, and we couldn't get around to answering them. You can stay connected with her and provide some feedback on the session by scanning that QR code as well, or follow any of us on social media. We were so excited to have you all, and thank you for spending a Thursday evening with the Reading League, North Carolina, and Benchmark Education. Thank you all.